Section 1, The Past and Early Years of My Life, by Bruce Wilton. Dear reader, I've spent years studying the craft of writing, and I know that a compelling narrative should evoke emotion and draw you into the story through vivid scenes and immersive detail. I've also been studying the latest research in psychology and neuroscience that has profoundly influenced how I understand and tell my story. Yet for this first section, I must break a cardinal rule of storytelling. I will be telling you rather than showing you much of what happened. This isn't a failure of memory or craft, but a consequence of survival. Through a combination of dissociation, what lay people call blocking out memories, and years of intensive therapy, the specific details of repeated physical assaults by my parents, and yes, I use the word assaults deliberately, as these were not punishments but acts of violence, have been processed, metabolized, and in many cases dissolved. What remains are the memories of having nightmares about these events, the somatic imprints of fear, and the knowledge that these things happened without the accompanying sensory details that would make for gripping narrative. When my sister engages in gaslighting about our childhood, the confusion isn't about which particular incident she's disputing. It's that there were so many that they blur together in a haze of normalized terror. This section chronicles my journey through shyness, social anxiety, and what might be best characterized as social phobia, a fear so complete that it required total avoidance. Paradoxically, by avoiding what I feared most, I never experienced the typical anxiety symptoms others describe. No sweaty palms, no racing heart, as I contemplated asking someone on a date. Instead, there was simply absence, a void where connection should have been. I'll share stories from my college years, including my experiences with 2 young women I dated, each relationship lasting exactly 1 date, as I began the slow work of emerging from my invisible shell. The background in this section is essential groundwork. At 23, I experienced what felt like waking up for the first time in my life. We're not there yet. That awakening, that full immersion into living that begins in Section 2, where the narrative becomes what you'd expect from a memoir, immediate, sensory, emotionally resonant. Recent research, as Lisa Feldman Barrett explores in How Emotions Are Made, reveals there are no single necessary characteristics of any emotion. This understanding has been crucial in making sense of my own experience, why my anxiety didn't look like textbook anxiety, why my trauma responses were more absence than presence. For now, I ask for your patience as we traverse this necessary landscape of context. Think of this section as the foundation upon which the house of my story will be built. Some details might feel sparse, but they represent what remains after the essential work of healing has been done. Chapter 1, The Birth of Shame. Before I ever knew the word for shame, I had already absorbed its weight, not from a single moment of humiliation, but from a slow erosion of safety, emotional neglect that left me starving for comfort, for gentleness, for someone to notice my fear and say, "You're okay." The earliest years of my life are not defined by memories, but by their absence, by the hollow space where warmth should have been. And in that silence, shame grew. It would shape the way I spoke, or didn't speak, the way I looked at others, and how I would eventually disappear from my own life without realizing I was gone. One might think that nobody remembers the earliest years of their life, but I am talking about what I knew when I was very young, that I would not have fond or happy memories with my parents. The earliest years of life can only be discerned from second-hand stories we're told. As a toddler, my parents bought me a fire truck, and when it made a sound, I was terrified. I can only imagine. from the story and my later experiences that I wouldn't have received the comfort I would have offered a child myself. No soothing words telling me everything was okay and that I was safe. Instead, my parents told this story with frustration lacing their voices. It's the opposite of how I respond to my cat when a pot or pan falls to the floor and startles him. I gently call him back with soothing sounds. Come here, kitty. It's okay. You're okay. Yes, I name my cat Kitty. These were the years of emotional deprivation, the birth of shame. My earliest memory is of water, learning to swim with an instructor who was in her late teens or early 20s. I am 4 or 5. The indoor pool at the Y, the warmth of the water against my skin, the vastness of it stretching beyond my reach. I remember floating near the wall, small and weightless, swimming toward the instructor. Then a moment of panic. The deep end offered no bottom to secure myself. My arms flailed. My breath caught in my throat. I saw the instructor was nearby. I don't know what gave me courage, but I leapt. I wrapped my arms around her, clinging to her like my life depended on it. She steadied me, her arms firm, unshaken. My heart pounded against her shoulder, but she didn't let go. I was safe, but something else lingered. Not just relief, something deeper, something I wasn't meant to have. I wasn't supposed to know what it felt like to be held, to be protected, to be cared for. And even at 4 or 5 years old, I knew that. That is the birth of shame. This was the first time I knew what it felt like to be held, and the first time I knew I wasn't supposed to want it. The indifference I knew from my family told a story about who I was and how I should think of myself. The house of unspoken rules and child abuse. I don't remember my parents ever holding me like that swimming instructor. In my family, affection was something distant, implied, rather than given. Love was duty, gratitude was expected, respect was mandatory and not earned. My father, Bruce Sr., was a man of unshakable silence. He believed actions spoke louder than words, but his actions were cold efficiency. He provided, and that was enough. My mother, Kathy, was a storm you learned to anticipate, never knowing when lightning would strike. There was a chill in the air, a tension that wrapped around me like a vice. It was the kind of silence that demanded submission, not understanding. I never looked directly at my father's face. I kept my gaze down, or slightly averted, as if instinctually avoiding something dangerous. The thought going through my mind was that I should not expect an easy explanation of what I did wrong. My mother's nature was more volatile, though that would become more obvious later in life. I felt that I was being met with a general sense of disapproval for being. Later in life, I would become incredibly skilled at reading people's body language. I had so much to learn because I purposefully chose to avoid observing the looks of general disapproval, refuge and frailty. Our maternal grandparents were our refuge, our shield. They moved in with us when we were very young. Grandpa had my mother when he was 48 and my grandma was 40, which meant that when I was born, my grandmother was 66 and Grandpa was 72. For whatever reason, they didn't age well, which shaped my impression about what it meant to get old. On one hand, they were a refuge just by their position as parental figures to my parents. On the other hand, they were frail. My grandfather had lost his vision. This created a sense of distance that is uncomfortable for me to write into words. I remember the skin hanging off my grandmother's arms. Her legs were discolored, and she had a scar or mark on her leg. Grandma was staying in the dining room that had been converted into a bedroom. She needed a walker to get around. Grandpa stayed upstairs. In retrospect, I wonder now what could have reduced them to such weakness. This distance that existed as a result of me seeing them as old and unhealthy kept me from having the true relationship that many children have with their grandparents. To this day, I am shocked to discover that some people are grandparents who don't bear any of the signs of what old was imprinted upon my childhood mind to mean. I remember Grandma standing up for me, her frail voice telling my parents, "Don't hurt him." I might have been 10 years old at that time. That small moment, that whisper of resistance, was the only time someone tried to intervene. Grandpa would worry about me lifting too much when I joined him to take out the garbage once a week, stacking the garbage pails in a way that would ensure dogs couldn't get into them. He was very protective of me and worried about me getting hurt. I was concerned about not being a wimp or a sissy, which is not what Grandpa intended, but being a tiny boy made me feel a pull away from being seen as weak. The art of hiding. I began to hide. In kindergarten, I literally hid behind a chair instead of walking up to the front of the room with my milk money. We lived in Southington, Connecticut, near the end of a dead-end street. There were woods around our home, a small mountain, Ragged Mountain, and trees to climb. This offered a way for me to hide by myself in the woods. Around this age, there was one incident where a few boys taunted me. This would not be repeated. My life was not defined by any form of bullying or torment from other kids. I recall at about age 8 or 9, my mother ushered me out to play with the neighborhood kids after school. I found a telephone pole and hid behind it, my small body pressed against the rough wood, hoping no one would notice me. The world felt too big, too loud, too dangerous. Maybe if I just stay here, no one will notice. Maybe if no one sees me, I can't get hurt. A brief respite. Then the world felt safe in 3rd grade. I was still thin, but I wasn't afraid. I had a friend, Paul Plourde, and that made all the difference. His presence was like armor. With him beside me, I could face anything. One day, I sat at my desk in Mrs. Felt's classroom when a girl named Donna stood up and declared, "I like Bruce." My face burned crimson. Then, to make things worse, she leaned in and kissed me on the cheek. Back then, before 5th or 6th grade, boys didn't like girls. The age-old idea of girls having cooties was part of our culture, this bizarre notion that we could get infected by being touched by a member of the opposite sex who was the same age as us. When Donna said this, the class erupted in giggles. Heat crawled up my neck, spreading to my ears. I didn't know what to do, so I said the first thing that came to mind, the thing I thought boys were supposed to say: "I hate girls." Mrs. Felt chuckled and turned to the other teacher in the room. "Aren't they a cute couple? It's strange, the game we played when we were kids. When did it change? By 5th or 6th grade, when it was suddenly okay to admit that you liked girls.